Hello, everybody, and good afternoon. I want to do a little sharing with my friends and colleagues who are in addiction services today. If you haven't watched my videos before, let me tell you that my name is John Solano. I've been a professional counselor for over 30 years now. I've been a family therapist for the last 10 years. And of course, I've worn a number of hats in my career, and one of the most notable was my very first experiences as an addictions counselor in Washington State, where I was doing chemical dependency evaluations and counseling for adult criminal offenders and people going through divorce and child custody situations. And back then I was working for a place called Alternative Intervention Resources. It used to be called TASC, which is Treatment Alternatives to Street Crime. So some of you may know that program, and that was in Seattle, Washington. But yeah, like many of you, started out my career with an intense interest in psychology and just a deep desire to figure out more about why people what they do. And then I got involved, if you will, in the addictions field and addiction studies in university, and followed that and became very intrigued. Once I embarked on that part of my career, of course, we were surrounded by and often referred to the 12-step model of recovery. And one of the sayings that I used to hear quite often was this one. It's a disease model, but a spiritual program. A disease model, but a spiritual program. And I got really curious about what that meant in terms of it being a spiritual program. And I think what I was intrigued with, what that really meant for me, was that there was something unique, very unique to us as human beings, in that, most of us change, if you will, in a traditional way, which takes time. But there's this other thing called transformation. And I think that's what we hope for in our recovery, that we go through a transformation. We become something better than what we were before. And I certainly saw my share of transformations in working with adult criminal offenders and others. But again, this idea that it was a disease model spiritual program got me more interested in I guess you could say the rest of my education over the last 30 years has been in transpersonal psychology, depth psychology, mythology, and Jungian psychology. And looking, again, I want to say more deeply into what is at the heart of the matter. What really touches a person's heart, what really creates transformation rather than change. And so one of the things that the medical model seemed to do, and we all understand why, but it kind of offered an explanation of things that really kind of extracted the idea of personal accountability. I mean, I believe that, when people find a way to discontinue their harmful use of substances, and whatever the addiction is, and we all know as human beings we can become addicted to pretty much anything. So we need to really widen the discussion here in terms of what addiction could be and is. But we know that there's a place in there where people do have to make a choice. And sometimes it feels like that choice, if you will, comes from a transpersonal part of ourselves. So I began to move through some of my own journey on some chronic problems that I had been dealing with, whether it be unemployment or health problems, or I've wrestled with anxiety for most of my life, and much more significantly, when I was younger, in my 20s, experienced full-blown panic attacks in and out of the hospital. They would always say there's nothing wrong with me. But that being said, I got to looking at that stuff and the recovery that I would be making from that. And I began to meet some teachers who were suggesting, again, a more personal approach, an approach that once again contained personal accountability. And as I brought into that as well, looking at issues of trauma and how human beings respond to traumatic incidences, I began to see something else reveal itself. Now, again, a medical model seems to suggest that people can come into addiction almost like innocent bystanders and just happen to fall victim to it. Now, I think there's a piece, if you will, of addiction that that really benefits, or the explanation of addiction that really benefits from a medical explanation. And of course, I think that part is that when we're involved in any indulgence of any kind for any length of time, it's going to have effects physiologically on us. It's going to change our brain structures. It's going to change our physiology. And I think that's where the medical model comes in handy, and how it's able to give insight to that. But again, studying the dynamics of trauma, I began to see something quite different show up. And that difference is kind of a reaction to trauma. You got to think about it this way. Trauma, and this is what I'm sharing with people and have been for the last 20 years, trauma at least has two pieces to it. One, there's the victim piece. There's feeling hurt. But then underneath that, there's also a revenge piece. And that's the piece that we don't want to talk about very much. That's why I appreciate the Jungian stuff around the shadow aspects of the psyche, because there are elephants in the living room, if you will, that we are not talking about, especially right now in society, where so much of the theories and the ideas are out there that are very focused on the victim narrative. They're focused, just on that hurt that comes with having been traumatized, but they don't speak to what's underneath that, which is the revenge motive. So without saying a lot more about that, what I also began to uncover was what I just mentioned earlier, an indulgence aspect, an indulgence way of looking at things when it comes to an addiction. So what is an indulgence? An indulgence, the definition, is a free will choice. You got to get that piece. It's a free will choice to engage in any thought, process, or thing that creates adverse consequences. So when we willingly choose to participate in any thought, process, or thing that creates adverse consequences, that qualifies an indulgence. It's a free will choice. That's why it's called an indulgence. It's not a disease, it's an indulgence. Another way to think of indulgences is that they're guilty pleasures. Guilty pleasures. So when we do something that we know we shouldn't do, why? Because it has adverse consequences, that's called an indulgence. So you got that? That's an indulgence, is when we partake in some thought, process, or thing that depletes us. It's not a life-giving experience. It's a life-taking experience. It's a depleting experience that we have. But we willfully do it. And we do this all the time. It can't be denied. And this is something that is very unique to the human psyche, is that even though we know what the right thing to do is, we can override it with this thing called free will. Now, as a family therapist, I see this every day, multiple times. People yelling at each other, hurting each other, being rude, disrespectful, what have you. And when I have a one-on-one conversation with these people and say, I bet you know now that what you did wasn't the right thing to do, they'll say, yeah, I know. I said, but in that moment that you did it, You didn't, you thought otherwise. And they'll say, yeah. So it's not that you didn't know what the right thing was. You just chose not to do it. Absolutely, they'll say. Well, why? What's your story? You see, every indulgence is based upon a feeling of entitlement. So the question then is, how did you entitle yourself to the indulgence? How did you give yourself permission? That's part of the way the mechanics work in the human psyche. We can't do anything that we know we shouldn't do. We can't do anything that is against our core virtues, our core convictions, unless we first build up a case. Otherwise, that's called rationale, right? Rationalization. Otherwise, if a person did something self-destructive, if a person did something that they know they shouldn't do and it's against their core convictions and virtues, and those core convictions and virtues are the way to health and vitality, so to do other than that is actually the way to death and depletion, for somebody to choose that negative route would look insane, right? That's an insane choice. It doesn't look rational. So we have to rationalize what we're going to do. And we rationalize that through stories that we tell ourselves. So to make a long story short, I've been able to uncover this whole dynamic of what I call, the first article I wrote was called Addiction as Indulgence and Entitlement. I want to invite you guys to see like the precursors to addiction. There's a medical component to it, absolutely. But before that shows up, because of the trauma experiences that people have experienced, especially, there is a precursor dynamic to that. It's a dynamic of indulgence and entitlement. Actually, the feeling of entitlement comes first, and then the indulgences come. And that feeling of entitlement is linked to something very core in the psyche about who we are, which is another elephant in the living room that people don't want to talk about. But it is a fundamental fact that is referred to in many, if not all, decent wisdom teachings or spiritual traditions. It speaks to the nature of who we are. And that core of the nature of who we are contains within it, if you will, the basic constructs of entitlement and indulgence. Now, I've created an entire philosophy called the empowerment philosophy, and I've created a model that can be applied called the integrity model, and I've also created within that, or unveiled within that, the entitlement as indulgence dynamic. So what I want to say to you is that I want to invite you to begin thinking about the possibility that the precursors to addiction show up well before the addiction, what we would call the addiction traditionally. And it really is quite built into our psyche, and there's a reason why we need to be involved in disciplines. As a family counselor, I often say, well, what do you think maturation is all about? Becoming a mature person is, letting go of all the immaturities, of all those things infantile and adolescent, so we can become what we call a mature grown-up adult. That's why we need a discipline. That's why we need disciplines. It's those disciplines that help us, if you will, kind of trim those rough edges off and grow up to be contributing, law-abiding citizens. So that's what I want to offer you right now. If you're in that field, I would love to come and chat with you more about this idea. Like I said, I developed the philosophy, I developed the applications, I put those to use back in the 90s, and even more recently, I have in the 2000s, 2003, I was the supervisor of a program called the Baristas Youth Skills Link program, where we were dealing with traumatized teenagers who had mental health issues, addiction issues, etc. And we got awesome results. And I was using this philosophy and a curriculum that I developed and providing them with the training and the information around the entitlement and the indulgence stuff and how to move through that, how to move beyond that. So I'd love to begin these conversations with you. If you're in the addictions field, I think it's time that we had a different conversation. I mean, like I said, I started my career 30 years ago as an addiction counselor, and I've seen a lot of different crises, as many of you have, come through society. Back then, it was certainly heroin has always been a problem. Then it was marijuana laced with PCP, and then it was cocaine, then it was crack cocaine, then it was meth, and then it was, you name it. There's been, a half a dozen, different crises that have come through. And every time that happens, all the best minds in the community and in the world get together and come up with what's something. But I really, to tell you, in 30 years, I haven't really heard much new at all. And in fact, what I see more than ever is that there's just this, raising the white flag. It's like, hey, there's not a heck of a lot we can do, so let's just triage this and, set up safe injection sites so we can try to save as many lives as possible. But, we don't really seem to have the answer as to really helping people become free from it. I agree with you. I think there needs to be more treatment services out there, more residential services. But I think even that, we need to have a new discussion on some of the deeper kinds of underpinnings of addiction. I think it's been long overdue. Like I said, I think there are elephants in the living room that we don't talk about, either, socially among friends and certainly not in the field. And right now, it may not even be politically correct, but as we all know, there are lives at stake and lots of suffering going on that doesn't need to happen. And so if you feel that way at all and you feel like it's time for, to talk about those elephants in the living room and to have some different discussions, then let's do that. And I'd love to come and share some of my material with you. And a lot of it is on my YouTube channel. You'll see it there in terms of the entitlement and indulgence dynamic that I've developed. And I do have some workshops and other things that I'd like to share with you and your participants. So shoot me a text, if you will, or actually email me at quest792. That's QUEST and 792 at gmail.com. And then you can phone me at 604-229-0328. I'm also on LinkedIn. Just, find me there and shoot me a invite, and, we'll be in each other's networks. And also subscribe to my YouTube channel, and that way you'll have the latest stuff that comes out. And feel free to, it's all free, so feel free to share that with your clients and others. So I'll look forward to hearing from you. Let's see if we can, can open up the floor here for some really good discussions. Take care.